From the land down under, with the rock at its centre, comes the little Aussie Watchman. The effect of comprehensive sex education versus abstinence education for high school students is in the news again. Multiple global players such as UNESCO have maintained that sex education has dramatically improved the sexual well-being of adolescents. This claim is no longer supported by the evidence. It's no longer valid. In fact, the evidence overwhelmingly states that there is no benefit at all, and comprehensive sexual education can actually be detrimental as it can lead to earlier sex experimentation. A recent publication called Re-Examining the Evidence investigated the three largest surveys, two sponsored by the US federal government, the Teen Pregnancy Prevention Evidence Review, and a meta-analysis study supported by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and one conducted for the United Nations. No programs produced sustained reduction in teen pregnancy or sustained reduction of STDs. And although some studies showed some reduction in abstinence, these could not be replicated by later studies. In fact, 5 of the studies demonstrated an increase in teen sexual behaviour and consequent teen pregnancy. The study's conclusion was, in fact, the research evidence indicates that comprehensive sexual education has essentially been ineffective in US school classrooms and has produced a concerning number of negative outcomes. The evidence for abstinence education, though limited, looks more promising. Of course, I didn't need the evidence to show this. Having a teenage kid who had received comprehensive sex education, both my wife and I were at pains to point out to our child the dangers of such education. Common sense tells us that while a basic level of education is worthwhile, an in-depth and comprehensive sex education would logically lead to more interest and therefore more participation in sexual activity. And in the teen group, that inevitably leads to harmful sexual activity. Why is this concept so hard to grasp? A similar argument was made in the 1980s and 90s that watching violent movies and playing violent video games would not increase violence in an individual. Common sense told us that this was a complete load of garbage. Thankfully, science finally caught up with common sense, and now it is well known that indeed violence begets violence. Such is also true of sex education. Sex will beget sex. Of course, that does not mean that some level of knowledge regarding the harms and how to avoid them is not required. Most would agree that this is reasonable, but comprehensive sex education is just another secular mistake based on significant spiritual deception. To the immoral, immorality requires justification. What better way to justify and normalize sex outside of the sacrosanct space of man and woman in marriage than to preach it and brainwash teenage kids with comprehensive sexual education? My teenage kid was told that sex with other teens was required to mature normally. Of course, the opposite is true. Fornication is both dangerous to the body and mind and spirit, both in the short and long term. It is a snare for the foolish and a hook for the perverse. I have attached a link down below to the study I have quoted today.